As we reach the final lecture video in the first chapter of perspective drawing, let's go over some of the pitfalls and mistakes that you might face while drawing in perspective. Sometimes knowing the right ways to draw is only half the battle. Knowing how things might go wrong is the other half. So why is it important to know how things go wrong? Well, an incorrect initial perspective drawing will affect the rest of your work later. Think of perspective work like the initial structure of a building. If the base of your drawing is wrong, it won't be long before the rest of the building falls down. Making mistakes in the initial perspective sketch makes it much harder to correct it later on. Another reason why is that a single perspective mistake can impact the overall quality of your drawing. Everyone looking at your work would realize something is wrong, but they won't be able to know why. But an artist will know, and even yourself may realize the mistake way later, that you may have to redraw most of your work just to fix a single mistake. And that gets us to the fact that these mistakes are often hard to detect, and you only realize what you did wrong later in the process, resulting in you going back and forth trying to fix the initial sketch while deleting tons and tons of detailed work on top. So in order to avoid the headaches of reworks, let's talk about the most common mistake beginner artists do when drawing in perspective. I would divide these mistakes as technical mistakes like wrong perspective, horizon line, or vanishing points, and perception mistakes like wrong path, wrong duplications, or wrong measurements. And finally, details issues, like adding too much details, too little, or no variation. You can look at them as three stages of perspective drawing. Technical mistakes usually happen in the start of your construction. Perception mistakes are usually in the middle of your work as you set up the object inside your scene, while the detailing mistakes happen as you finish up your drawing and putting up the final touches. So if you made the technical mistakes, the rest of the drawing will suffer from bad construction, and no matter how much details you add to it, it won't save your drawing. If you had some perception mistakes, your object might look right, but something will look off. It will look like a confused perspective scene, and people won't know what's wrong with it, but they will just know it's not correct. Finally, the detailing mistakes will happen at the end as you are finishing up. And even if the construction is correct and the perspective is correct, adding bad details at the end or the wrong ones will mess up all the hard work you did previously. So knowing every stage issues and correcting them before moving on to the next stage is essential to make sure your final drawing is constructed right, looking correct, and finished up in a nice and correct manner. With that said, let's start with the technical mistakes that beginner artists make. We can start with not constructing your perspective correctly. This is the most common thing I see beginner artists do, and it's mostly due to lack of knowledge in perspective drawing, or not knowing the essential rules of perspective. This is what happens when you guess where the perspective lines are, where the vanishing point, or where the horizon line should be without doing the initial work. That's when you start seeing weird distortions with the object, lines not matching, or not being parallel within the same object. The result will look wrong, and no matter how much details you add on top, it will never look right to you or to anyone looking at your work. This mistake can be due to wrong placement of the horizon line, wrong placement of the vanishing point, incorrect connection to the perspective lines, or not following the right perspective type within the object. To fix this, all you need to do is to establish the right perspective type with the correct horizon line, vanishing points, and perspective lines. Once you do that with the initial sketch, everything will fit right in, and the final result will look correct and in the right perspective. Once you have the correct parameters for your perspective, all objects drawn within it have to look correct no matter where you place them within your canvas. Now you don't have to mess up all the elements of perspective to have a bad drawing. You may mess up one of those elements to get a bad drawing out of it. For example, you can draw an object with the wrong levels compared to the horizon line. For example, drawing the horizon line above the object and not showing the top side of that object, or drawing it lower than the object and not seeing the bottom side of it. You can even draw the horizon line going through the object itself but showing the top or the bottom of the object when you should not see either of it. All these situations can be fixed by observing the placement of the horizon line and checking that your object is connecting to the right vanishing point in the horizon line. Remember that anything above the horizon line will show the bottom of it, and anything on the bottom of the horizon line will show the top of it. Another technical mistake you can do is misplacing the vanishing points on the horizon line, either by placing them so far away that your perspective looks flat, or too close together that your perspective becomes too distorted. In general, you don't want to have a vanishing point inside of your canvas, but you also don't want them all the way toward infinity. You need to have a good balance of distortion and correct angles to make sure that your drawing looks interesting and correct. Place the points too wide and your lines will start to look parallel and flat. place the points too close, and your whole view will look weird and over distorted. The reason is not the angles themselves, it's mostly how the lines will look like close to the vanishing points. In the area between the vanishing points, lines might seem fine, but as you get closer to either of the vanishing points, things will start to look very distorted, especially in the 2 or 3 points perspective. You won't have the same issue with the 1 point perspective since we already have flat horizontal lines there. But when you have 2 or more vanishing points, you need to be away from either vanishing point to get a good balance. So to fix this mistake, just be safe and place both vanishing points away from the frame of your canvas and make your canvas smaller, so you know where the vanishing points will be outside the limits of your frame. This way you will get the best of both worlds, knowing where your vanishing points are and not drawing a distorted perspective. Another technical mistake would be perspective lines not reaching the vanishing point. This can be made mostly by accident. I even did it a couple of times while drawing the examples of this course. When you get into the zone and hurry up to finish the initial sketch, you might end up connecting the perspective lines around the vanishing point and not exactly toward the center of it. Connecting two sides of the box to two different locations around the vanishing point will end up resulting in some weird measurements on your object, especially if you are using the lines to divide your object or do delicate measurements. It can also result in distorted objects if the misalignment is too large. To fix this, you simply need to slow down a bit and make sure you are connecting to the right point. If you already made this mistake, you can always delete the edge you drew and reconnect it to the correct vanishing point. Sometimes it's not just an edge that is connected wrong. Sometimes the whole face of an object is connected to the wrong vanishing point, resulting in misaligned object that doesn't connect right. It's the same mistake but with larger impact, so make sure you stop every now and then and just check the perspective lines and where they connect. If the lines become too busy and you can't see where you connect anymore, work on a different layer and hide the layers that you are already done with before adding more lines on top. This way you will have a clearer version of where you are drawing the lines and where they are connecting at. This is basically it for the technical mistakes we might do when we start drawing in perspective. The second type of mistakes is more toward the perception of perspective. Wrong depth, wrong measurements, or wrong scale might affect our work even if the technical aspect of it is correct. This is a bit more of an advanced stage of mistake that you might get into even with everything being drawn technically correct. So for example, drawing the wrong depth. One of the perception mistakes is drawing the wrong depth for objects. For example, drawing boxes with very long depth toward the vanishing point, or replicating the distance of the front face as the depth of the box. Foreshortening is what makes us receive objects getting smaller as they go toward the horizon. Objects, figures, or buildings all start to go smaller and smaller as we go back into perspective. Drawing things with large or incorrect depth makes the drawing look weird and unprofessional. Deciding where the object ends is crucial when drawing in perspective. To fix this, you can always use the vision cone and measurements points to find the exact depth of an item in comparison to other dimensions, as we did before. But in general, practicing perspective drawing over and over from reference photos or real life will sharpen your perception skills and make sure the depth of an object gets an appropriate measurements while drawing in perspective. Always remember that objects get smaller as they go away from us and larger as they move toward us. An object going toward the horizon line cannot be larger than the same object in front of us. That applies to everything. Draw nature, buildings in a city, or an interior room. They all conform to the same rules of depth in perspective. Another problem with depth can be the other way around, not having enough depth, or drawing objects with little to no depth. For example, here we have a building, but the depth is too small to be realistic. It's not going far enough into perspective. But this issue can also be not that obvious. For example, drawing this window frame, the frame might be correct in dimensions, but the depth or the thickness of the frame is too small. So we need to extend it a bit more into the perspective to add more volume to the object. And this is how it's fixed, by increasing the depth according to the object dimensions. Sometimes an ornament or a column that doesn't have sharp edges can also suffer from the wrong depth. It might be too narrow or too wide, so we can adjust that by either doing the correct calculations or observing the object in reality or photos to know how much depth it should have. Now if we merge the previous examples together and draw a building block with windows and doors on it, we can tell when things are not deep enough if we drew lots of examples on daily basis. We would know this window is flat, so we should add more depth to it. And the depth should be appropriate with the dimensions of the object, so it doesn't look too deep or too shallow. We can do the same for the door, but sometimes we give the door a bit more depth since it has to have a bigger frame, but also that depends on the design itself. And sometimes it's the other way around, and so on. Here we have another example. We have these columns or a fence going toward the horizon, but the depth of every column looks exactly the same as the one before it. This will look very, very wrong as you go further. The correct way is to add the depth of the first column and then duplicating that by connecting it to the vanishing point, and limiting your depth by the size of the first column. The same can be said for the widest part of it as well. This way you will end up with the large depth for the first column and smaller ones as you go further into the perspective. Because as we mentioned, objects do tend to look smaller as they go back toward the horizon. Another perception mistake is drawing wrong measurements or duplications of an object. This mistake can be due to wrong measurements or missing the points where you should be connecting. For example, here we have the correct points right there, but either due to rushing it or not focusing enough, we start missing the middle point, and before you know it, the measurements are all wrong. The spaces are not getting smaller as we go toward the horizon, so if you didn't catch that right away, you might build hours of details on top only to find out that the construction was all wrong from the beginning, and it will take forever to correct them later on. So fixing this might be simply paying attention, especially at the early stages of construction, so you don't have to deal with all this headache later on down the line. The same can also happen with measurements. When you don't divide the lines in an equal way, it will result in drawing different segments that will mess up things later on for you. So make sure that the divisions are done correctly so your object can be divided equally as well. Perception mistakes can also happen with figures in perspective, not only objects. One of the major mistakes is not to match the figure heights in perspective. Even though we can see here three figures that might get smaller as they go back into perspective, it isn't correct. If we draw lines from the top and bottom from the first figure, we can clearly see how the other figures are way higher than they should. If we follow the guidelines, this is what the figure should look like at the same height as it goes back into perspective. So not following correct guidelines will result in weird height that will make some figures look like 2 or 3 meters tall as they go back into perspective. The same issue can happen with different figures. Now other figures can be taller or shorter, but they shouldn't look like giants. For example, here we have the same height of a figure, but in a different location. The right one should look smaller if it's around the same height, so the scale of the figure versus the placement of it do not match. To correct this, we add the guidelines for the first figure and extend from it a line at the same level of the second figure to see how high it should be. From that we can see that the second figure should be much smaller. And this is the correct placement and scale for the second figure. A third example of how we can draw figures wrong is in regards to other objects. Here we have a figure in the foreground, and we want to draw another one near the door of that building. If we did the same guidelines of the previous example, we can get the correct height of the second figure. But as you can see, the figure, even though that it's in the correct scale and placement, is not correct in relation to the building. The building door should be around 2.4 or 2.5 meters high, so the figure should be shorter than the door. So now we know that the foreground figure is drawn too tall. So let's draw the figure near the door in the correct size and duplicate that back toward the first guideline. And now we have both figures drawn correctly in relation to the building. Now, the foreground figure won't look like a giant in comparison to the building. So keep these guidelines in mind when you add figures to your scene, because one exaggerated height and the whole scene will start breaking apart. Sometimes you might do the correct guides, but if you don't know how things actually should look like in reality, these mistakes might happen even when you are careful. So observing the real world is the key in knowing how things should look like in perspective. Alright, and that is all for the perception mistakes. Let's talk about the last part of mistakes beginner artists will do, and that's the detailing mistakes. These will happen after you pass the technical phase and the perception phase with no issues. You might end up with failing into them at the last part of your drawing. These can be easily handled if they are caught early on. If you finish up your drawing without noticing them, you might have to redo the whole detailing part all over again. One of these mistakes is one that you might easily not see till it's too late, and that is drawing objects and items tangent to the horizon line. Now this can also be a perception mistake, but I included it here because it's more of a choice than a mistake. It might not be an issue if you are drawing a building on top of the horizon line, but when the top of the object is aligned exactly to the horizon line, it will just look weird. It It will also look uncomfortable for the viewer to see. You need to either extend the building above the line or shorten it to be below the horizon line. Drawing objects tangent to the horizon line will end up flattening the object and remove the illusion of the three-dimensional form from it. The same thing can happen with objects near each other, so it's not just the horizon line, but drawing objects so close together with only a little space in between also will look weird. So either extend the objects to overlap into each other or separate them in a way that looks more easy on the eye. Another detailing mistake is constant line weight all around your drawing. Now this is not much of a perspective issue, but more of a line weight issue. But since we included line weight in this course, I thought we should mention it here. If you draw all lines with no line weight variation, the whole drawing will be too busy to look at. You need to vary your line weight as we saw in the previous examples to make sure the viewer looks exactly where you want him to look. It's also important to add depth to your object, because constant line weight all over the place will flatten your image and work against your illusion to convey a 3D scene to the viewer. For example, here we have a box with segments all done in the same line thickness. It looks very busy to look at, too flat as well. So the solution here is to add the thickest line in the foreground and lightening them up a bit as you go into perspective. We also need to remember the line weight rules, exterior versus interior lines, segmentations, atmospheric perspective, and so on, and to go lighter as we recede into the background. This looks much easier to observe, and it emphasizes the depth of the object as it goes further into the horizon, rather than it being all the same line weight with no indication of perspective except the technical and perception part of it. That's why it's important to notice these issues in every stage before moving on to the next one. And you can see the difference here between the two drawings. One have more professional touch to it and more depth, while the second is just too flat. Another example here we have with a simple box. If you understand how line weight work on a simple box and how you can convey depth on it, you can handle more and more complex shapes as you move forward. The one in red looks like it's coming toward us in perspective, while the blue one is a flat drawing. Another issue that happens with more complex scenes is drawing patterns and lines in the same manner all the way to the horizon line. That will look really bad. As we can see here with the lines of the street and the building, they all look the same. And as we draw them in the same thickness and the same amount of details, we end up with just black lines at the vanishing point. That's why patterns should start fading away bit by bit as we go toward the horizon. And here we can see how it looks with less lines as we go toward the vanishing point. The focus now shifted to the foreground instead of the vanishing point. In the first one, all we look at is the black collection of lines going toward the vanishing point, which is not what we want the viewer to look at. So as you go back in perspective, you should be drawing less lines, less patterns, less details, and smaller line weight, because the opposite of that will look really, really bad. Another mistake I see is drawing every single detail in the scene all around, for everything and every item. The result of that is a mess. Lots of lines, lots of details, and a very lost viewer not knowing what to look at. On the right, we see this beautiful drawing, but it's so over-detailed, it lost the ability to guide the viewer around the scene. If we lower the details as we go toward the background, like we see here on the left, the scene already feels more relaxing to look at. Like the atmosphere is less aggressive and less busy, and you can understand the space much more than the one on the right. When it comes to perspective drawing and detailing, less is more. Give the viewer some empty space to breathe without being overwhelmed with details everywhere. Another example here with different degrees of details. And you can see the other side of what we just talked about. Over-detailing drawings everywhere like we see on the right is a very bad thing to do. And a lot of beginners do that, to be honest, thinking that it should be done, because more details is always good, right? But no, over-detailing is never good. In the same time, under-detailing the drawing is as bad as over-detailing. The one on the left is just fading away, almost too light to see or to understand. It needs more balance to where should the viewer look at. When we look at the one in the middle, we see the balance between the two, detailing the parts you want the viewer to look at while keeping some empty areas for the viewer to breathe and relax. Just look at all three together. You will find yourself gravitating toward the one in the middle automatically. just because it's much better to look at due to it having a focal point, a story, an intentional goal done by the artist to guide you around instead of letting you decide where or what to look at. And when the viewer have a choice to look at something, they will always go toward the story, the mystery, and the balanced focal point. The final mistake I can talk about is rushing to details and focusing on it before making sure you finish the previous two stages correctly. This is one of the biggest mistakes of them all. It's like the total amount of three stages mistake combined into one. If you rush to details right away without the correct construction and without the right perception of perspective, you will end up with a very detailed object that looks completely wrong. If you look at this shade, it looks very detailed, but the whole perspective looks crooked. If we are to reconstruct it in a simple line, we see the whole thing doesn't even make sense. The lines are going each and every way, without a unifying perspective. So let's reconstruct it again with the right perspective. Add the two stages of details without any textures or small details. And finally add the last stage of details on top, and you can see the difference between the two. Always remember that no amount of details will fix your drawing if the base construction is bad. That's why I took so long and so many lessons focusing on simple boxes in this course, before going into any detailed object. But once you know the basic principle of perspective, detailing is the simplest part of any drawing. It's the part where you relax and enjoy the process of detailing, while your brain will be on overdrive as you construct the basic sketch. So always focus on the first stage of construction. Take as much time as you need and never rush into details before everything looks correct and in the right perspective. Alright, to end this lesson, let's dive into a live demo of drawing this couch. The drawing here was done by a beginner artist, and we can see almost all three stages of mistakes in it. The construction is a bit wrong, the perspective line seems at odds to each other, and the detailing part is almost uniform along the whole object. So let's fix it. We start first with the bounding box for the whole couch. I then add a section for the legs of the couch and another one for the cushions on top. I make sure the lines are as close as possible to the reference photo, especially the vanishing point on both sides. Now we start the second part of detailing. Let's add the main shape of the couch first, including the armrests on both sides. After doing all the exercises in the previous lesson, you can start doing all the calculations and measurements mentally as you work around the object. If you are not ready yet to do this, as I always say, please go back and watch the initial videos and practice on them as much as you can before moving on to more complex shapes. After finishing the main shape of the couch, let's start adding the cushions all around. I make sure all my lines, including the soft lines and the curves, all follow the same perspective of the bounding box. That's the point of the bounding box, is to follow the same direction of the vanishing point on both sides. Now adding the legs and the bottom, the legs will also follow the same lines of perspective. They just need to be a little longer. So it's okay to get out of the bounding box when you need to, or you can go back to extend the bounding box in the first layer. Now that we are done with the initial drawing, I can now add the top level of details on the correct construction underneath it. While adding the final details, I'm also careful of my line weight as I draw, adding darker lines underneath the cushions and the bottom of the sofa, while adding the lighter lines for the interior ones and the interior details. Adding more values to the shadows as well as I move around the drawing. This whole drawing took about 20 minutes, but as always, take your time, especially with the early stages when you draw it in perspective, and make sure all your lines are correct. We are almost done here. Let's add the final fine details around, like more line weight here and there, some more values and shadows in between the cushions, and some textures and hatch lines around the drawing. And here it is. You can compare it to the drawing on top. You can see how much difference a correct construction, perception, and detailing can do to your drawing. It changes it from an amateur looking art to a good drawing that you can be satisfied with along with anyone looking at it. It's few basic rules and techniques that might look and sound very overwhelming at first, but if you follow the lessons all along from lesson 1 to here, everything will just fit in place and sound very logical and easy to follow. All you need now is to practice and practice and practice. And trust me, you're gonna fall in every single mistake I talked about. I know I did. That's how I knew what to look for in this lesson. So making these mistakes is not the issue. Repeating them over and over and over and not fixing them is the issue. Once you recognize what's wrong with your drawing and what you should do to fix it, that's where the real learning starts. Well, this was a very long lesson, but I hope you saw some of your mistakes in it and learned how to fix them. Practice will make all the difference in the world when drawing in perspective. So don't be discouraged by these mistakes, and use this lesson every time you need to check on your work to see what went wrong. Was it a technical mistake, a perception mistake, or a detailing mistake? And then move on to fix it, and work your drawing into the work of art that you will be proud of. This is basically it for the first chapter of the long journey of learning about perspective in the first book, which is the beginner part of it. But I will still add few more exercises videos for this chapter after this one. These exercises will go over all the things we learned so far, and add more ideas and examples for you to follow and make your own, as you practice the principles of perspective for the first chapter. So this is where the hard work comes along. Lots of examples, lots of exercises to do before deciding to move on to the next intermediate part of the perspective journey. Do not move to the next stage before you know pretty well that you learned everything about the rules of perspective, done all the examples from the previous lessons, and done all the exercises I will post after this video, along with your own practice and examples that you will do from reference or your own imagination. With that said, let's start doing some fun exercises in the next video. As always, if you like this lesson, feel free to leave a like. If you have any questions, leave them down in the comments section and I will do my best to answer them as soon as possible. To stay notified for future lessons, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you in the next lesson.